With pressure on the public purse growing, should MPs rule out future pay rises for themselves? Or are our representatives responsible for the lives of hundreds of thousands of constituents actually underpaid? Did the MPs' expenses scandal prove that it's time for those who lead us to get a bumper pay packet? To discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome spokesperson at the Taxpayers Alliance, DARWIN friend, former Conservative MP and 90s TV legend, Jerry Hayes, and Labour councillor, former head of Labour Leave, Brendan Chilton. Chaps, welcome to the show. First of all, DARWIN, I'll start with you. Do you think MPs should get a bumper pay rise?
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Mark. And to put it simply, I don't think they should be. I think given the dire consequences of the COVID finances, I think it would actually be pretty tin-eared of IPSA, who are the body that assess this, to give MPs a pay rise at this time. I mean, in the last year, there was a deficit of £300 billion and the public sector debt hit £2 trillion. And alongside that, other public sector staff saw their pay packets frozen. And so I think actually what needs to happen in the long term for IPSA is a better and a fairer way of assessing when and how much MPs should receive. And what we at the Taxpayers Alliance have suggested is that their salaries are tied to GDP growth and the economic performance of the country. So if GDP were to grow 1.5%, as it did in 2019, then MPs' salaries would go up by 1.5% as a result as well. And I think that would be a fairer way of assessing MPs' salaries, because it ties their remuneration to the implications of their actions, not only on their constituents, but to taxpayers up and down the country, who we all need to remember are the ones that are going to be footing the bill for any MP's pay rise.
Jerry, unfortunately, you're out of the House now and therefore not eligible for a pay rise, earning far more as a lawyer, no doubt, and TV pundit. But the current salary, April 2020, my colleague Cal has generated these figures for me, £81,932 for an MP. But an MP is the CEO of a corporation, hundreds of thousands of constituents. I would double it overnight. What's your view?
I would keep the whole question of MPs' pay out of MPs' hands, because when I first started as an MP in 1983, I was earning £25,000 at the bar, got elected unexpectedly and found my pay was £12,000, which was a hell of a pay cut. Look, they work very hard. It's a rotten job. I wouldn't do it if you paid me £1 million at the moment. It is a rotten job, and most MPs work very hard for their constituents. So let's keep it out of MPs' hands. The independent body's got to decide. And don't forget, they decided fairly recently that MPs' pay should be frozen for 21 and 22. But the reason for the expenses scandal, and actually it started with Margaret Thatcher, believe it or not, is that they all were afraid of actually dealing with the problem of MPs' pay. They're getting too much, we never know what's right for an MP. It's better for an independent body. And the reason we had the scandal of expenses, because everyone was encouraged, all parties were encouraged by their leaders, look, you can bump up your expenses. And that's just wrong. MPs shouldn't have to decide that. They really shouldn't. And it's not a bumper pay rise at all. They're not giving it to themselves. So I'm afraid DARWIN of the Taxpayers Alliance, really quite mad.
Well, I would pay them at least a couple of £100,000. But what's your view, Brendan Chilton?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that MPs don't actually have any fixed hours. Their one obligation is to be re-elected, which are their constituents. So I do think it is fair to say that our MPs, if you look at the comparisons across Europe, are quite pay low amounts compared, for example, to Italian or German MPs. But that said, I kind of agree with DARWIN. The current country at the moment is really sort of treading water. We've not got any accelerated growth. The government haven't really taken advantage of our new freedoms after we've left the European Union. Why do they deserve a pay rise? In the private sector, you get a pay rise for performance. Similarly, in large parts of the public sector. And at the moment, if anything, our Parliament needs a pay cut because the performance has not been very, very good. For the past few years, Many people in the private sector have actually had a 20% pay cut due to being in lockdown. The government only promised to, or only guaranteed, up to 80% of furlough payments. And for MPs right now, when we've got an energy crisis, when we've got increases in national insurance, people on the lowest incomes, those on universal credit, for example, experiencing a cut, I think it's absolutely outrageous that MPs should even be contemplating putting up their pay at this moment in time.
However,
but
Brendan,
they're not. That's
surely,
the point.
Yeah, go on, Jerry.
That's the point. MPs not contemplating it at all. It's the independent body, and of course, I'm sorry, but that's as mad as what Darwin was saying. How do you work out productivity for a member of parliament? You can't do it. Leave it to an independent body.
Well, productivity and an assessment of productivity happens every 5 years, Brendan, in an election.
Exactly.
Well, hang on a minute. You can measure productivity through the quarterly releases of figures that come out from the Office of National Statistics on employment, on growth, manufacturing productivity. So if MPs aren't doing their job properly, namely ensuring we've got the conditions for sound economic growth, why on earth should they be rewarded for a pay increase? And I think most people in the country...
Their job is to look after their constituents' problems. It's not about what's going to happen in the energy crisis. That's a matter for the executive, not for backbench MPs. MPs don't run anything. The government.
It is the job of members of Parliament to hold the executive to account and to ensure that members of the executive, namely the government, are in fact delivering on the promises of their manifesto and ensuring sound governance. And if they're not doing that, which evidently at the moment is not the case, I see no reason why IPSA should award them a pay rise.
But Brendan, why do we pay GPs and head teachers more than constituency MPs?
Because unlike MPs, GPs and head teachers actually have direct responsibility for outcomes for patients in the case of doctors and for children's outcomes in the case of schools. MPs don't have any budgets. They've got very limited powers, actually. Most of them are there to do as their whips are told and repeat the lines that they're given.
But it's nonsense, Brendan. It's such nonsense. I'll tell you why it's nonsense. You will find that the most senior consultants have the highest death rates. And they have the highest death rates because they actually take on the most difficult cases. So to talk about comparisons with MPs is really, I don't know what happens on planet Brendan, but it's not the real world.
Well, I tell you what, if you did a poll of the great British public, I bet 90% of them would be supporting my position as opposed to yours. I personally...
I'm sure they would. I'm sure they would, because they're being fed false information by people like you who really should know better.
So what do you think MPs' pay should be?
It's not for me to decide. It's not for MPs to decide. That's why we have an independent body.
But you are advocating an increasing pay for MPs. What should it be?
Well, Brendan, I would suggest it should be
advocating an increase in pay for MPs. We have a body to deal with it.
And
like we have a body to deal with nurses.
Should be offering a salary similar to that of the CEO of a small to medium-sized corporation. MPs are responsible for the well-being and livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of constituents. And the issue you've got, Darwin, friend, is that if you pay MPs £80,000, which, by the way, is a hell of a lot of money, but not for that level of responsibility, you're going to get a lower quality of candidate. There are people out there in industry, entrepreneurs, who just can't afford to go into politics. And for those people, you should make it worthwhile.
Well, I disagree with you on that, Mark, actually. I think £81,000 to a lot of people in this country is actually quite a lot of money. And I mean, for me personally, 81,000 wouldn't deter me.
Not if you're responsible for hundreds of thousands of people.
I mean, to be fair, MPs aren't actually responsible for hundreds of thousands of people in terms of their constituencies. It's under 100,000 per constituent.
70,000. They're responsible for about 70,000 people.
And 70,000, so not in the 100,000, not hundreds of thousands of constituents. And I think actually when you're going into politics, I don't think it's actually about how much money you can get out of it. I think it's actually about public service and being there to support your constituents rather than thinking this is going to be a good way to make loads of money out of it.
You don't make loads of money as a member of Parliament. You really don't. Okay.
If Mark is investing hundreds of thousands of pounds,
it's a bit rich coming from you and the Taxpayers Alliance, because you don't even tell us who funds your organisation. It's a secret.
Well, I'd be quite happy to tell you it's hundreds of thousands of. Sorry.
Tell us.
Well, it's hundreds of thousands of individuals up and down the country. I mean, if you look at the average donation that the Taxpayers Alliance actually receives, it's £500. And so it's not a lot of money. It's not multi-millionaires. It's just small, hard-working people who want to get a fair deal out of the government in this country.
Why are you guys just knocking members of Parliament? The majority of constituents. Of course you are. You've got this punitive idea of productivity payments.
Members of Parliament do an incredibly important job, but they are not directly responsible for people. Their job is to represent people. Responsibility and represent. Hang on a minute, shush. Responsibility and representation are two different things. They represent them just as a local councillor represents their local ward members. Now, if MPs were directly responsible for the delivery of services, health, education, highways, etc., all the things that we need, yes, that would warrant huge increases in pay because, frankly, they would be underpaid. But they are essentially paid to go to Parliament to raise issues of concern from people in their constituency. The most power an MP has got is the power to write a letter to a Minister of State or a Secretary of State to raise an issue, just as you and I and all of your viewers, Mark, have got the power to do. That is their sole power, really. They've got the power, of course, to remove and elect a government, but that seldom happens. They have no direct influence over policy and the implementation of policy at a local level. And so the notion that IPSA should be awarding them a pay increase because for whatever reason the cost of living, etc., has gone up. Well, if everybody else in the public and private sector gets an equal pay increase, then I'd be happy with it. But that is not going to happen.
So surprise, surprise, Brendan, as a councillor, you think that you have direct responsibility. I suppose you should get more money. Is that what you're after?
No, absolutely.
You want less money. You want less money. Do you want less money?
I do it for free, personally. I do it for free. I donate my allowance to Help for Heroes, the local branch of my local charity, because I think if you go into politics, you don't do it for money. You do it out of a sense of civic responsibility because you want to represent your local residents. Unfortunately, we've got to a situation in this country where we've got a political class who not only get their pay awards, many offices are privately funded through vested interests as well. There's a considerable expenses system. Now, the whole thing does need to be streamlined, in my opinion. I would rather us do away with expenses and give MPs a simple annual allowance. I think that would be far more transparent because at the moment, every member of the public looks at an MP and says, oh, you're all on the make. Well, a lot of them aren't. But the question is, at the moment, is it right that MPs should get a pay rise when we have got rising energy prices, inflation is on the increase, businesses are struggling, and people on low incomes are facing a cut? And the answer to that from any reasonable person is no.
It's not reasonable at all. And forgive me for saying it is absolutely ridiculous because inflation is going up. Prices are going up. There's going to be no more cheap money because interest rates are going up. Wages have gone up by 7.5%. Are you saying then that MPs shouldn't get a pay rise like everybody else? Of course.
What I'm asking is, should someone on the minimum wage, should their taxes go towards an increase for someone who's earning £75,000?
Yes,
and the answer to that is no.
The answer is yes, because they have a huge responsibility to tens of thousands of constituents. But chaps, I really appreciate the debate on that one. I'd love to ask our audience what you think. gbviews@gbnews.uk. My thanks to Darwin Friend from the Taxpayers Alliance, Jerry Hayes, former Conservative MP, and Brendan Chilton, Labour councillor.